In this video, we'll go over the big ideas of Chapter 8. So the first thing we did was introduce the sine law. We've improved it because in this chapter, the big focus is not on right triangles, it's on oblique triangles. So unfortunately, we can't really use the Pythagorean theorem. We can't really use the primary trig ratios. So we first introduced the sine law. Sine law is great, but unfortunately, we realized that there are certain scenarios that are presented to us, some conditions where the sine law can't really help us solve the triangle. So we also looked at the cosine law in our second lesson. So I gave the formula for sine law, the two different versions, and the two different versions for the cosine law. You can solve for the missing side or the missing angle. But for cosine law, I would personally just remember c squared equals a squared plus b squared minus 2ab cos c, because if I did want to solve for the angle, I just rearrange it. So I'll leave it up to you if you want to remember this version of the cosine law as well, but it's really the same thing. It's the same relationship. And after that, we wanted to make sure we understand when we use a cosine law and when we use a sine law. So if you're given angle, side, angle, 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 side, or side, side, angle, you should really use the sine law because you can complete one of the three ratios. And then you can progress to solve for the missing angle or the missing side. But if you're given side, 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 or side, angle, side, then you should use the cosine law. And then we talked about true bearing, conventional bearing. So that really just helps us with some word problems that deal with bearing, so we can draw the correct diagram and solve for what they want. And then after that, we solve for, it's basically what we did throughout the unit, but I just gave you some extra questions on some word problems to practice. Because we already did some word problems when we talked about sine law, when we talked about cosine law, and this is very reminiscent of what you did in chapter 7 when you're solving word problems with right triangles, except that for this unit, you're solving word problems involving oblique triangles. At the end of the day, all you really want to do is just draw the correct diagram and then use the correct trig tool. So once you're familiar with sine law and cosine law, hopefully the word problems aren't that challenging. I think the hardest part is really just interpreting the word problem and drawing the correct diagram. So that's basically it for chapter 8. In the previous chapter, we were focusing on solving right triangles, but in this chapter, we're focusing on solving oblique triangles using the sine law and the cosine law.